listening and problem solving were the two things I wrote down, right? And I think that's kind of what drove me to the UX, because I like puzzles and I like solving problems. And I think entrepreneurs are doing the same thing. They're trying to solve a problem that they've solved themselves.
Do UX designers make good entrepreneurs? You probably already know my answer to that, but let's talk about it anyway. Welcome back to the show, folks. Today, we're talking about whether or not UX designers make good entrepreneurs. I'm a UX designer. I'm an entrepreneur, and I don't know if I'm a good one, but I do think that UX design wires you for being able to detect problems, to be hyper aware of things that cause people friction in their lives and what they're trying to do. And I think that those are critical things to being a good entrepreneur. You first have to find a problem to solve in order to capture value for solving that problem. But I'm not just going to sit here and talk about it myself. I brought on my longtime colleague and former coworker, Joe Rapoza, to chat with me about this. And he has been an entrepreneur in the past. He's owned multiple businesses. He and I used to work together at a large bank in their digital customer experience department, and he's now senior manager of UX design at Charles Schwab. So now, without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, folks, we are here with Joe Rapoza, and he and I are talking today about what makes a UX designer potentially a great entrepreneur. But first, Joe, it's been a long time, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Devin. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So for the folks out in the audience, Joe and I used to work together at Wells Fargo. We were both in a digital customer experience group. And Joe, what are you doing now? What are you doing these days?
Yeah, so I left Wells Fargo a little over a year ago. So I'm working for Charles Schwab in the Bay Area. I live in Berkeley, and we have an office in San Francisco, and I've got a team on the UX side. We're digital, and I run basically have a team of content strategists, which is a little different than what I was doing at Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, I had a mixture, product designers, visual designers, interaction designers, and content strategists.
Oh, wow. Wow. That must be a big change. So like, how does that feel to you? What's that like?
It feels pretty good. It's a little more focused. I've always, as a designer, I've always had an eye towards content. And my wife, Laura Lynn, is actually a content strategy manager, or content design manager, they call it now, at PayPal.
Oh, cool.
So,
very cool.
Yeah. So we talk after work about, things about work.
That's awesome. That is awesome. That's cool to be in the same industry, in the same sort of like skill set area, and being able to talk about that. That's pretty neat. Do you guys ever have arguments about content strategy principles?
Not really on the principles, but we talk a little bit about people at our work, and the good, the bad. But yeah, it's all fun to talk about.
Very cool. Very cool. So you and I got to talking, and I've seen some of your posts on LinkedIn, and we got to talking about the idea of UX designers and entrepreneurship. What might make, I think you did a post about what might make a UX designer a good entrepreneur, because it's rare, right? Like you don't see a lot of CEOs who are designers. I mean, famously, right. The CEO of Airbnb is a designer, which is pretty cool. And there's another business that I've recently come across. The CEO, the founder of that company, is a designer, and they're doing well. I'm curious to know, what's your opinion? Do UX designers make good entrepreneurs?
I'd say the short answer is yes. Most of them will make great entrepreneurs. And as you know, when you work for a large corporation like Wells Fargo or Schwab, yeah, you wear many hats, right? So depending on the makeup of the team, you could do a little bit of research. You could do, a lot of, Figma. You could be in Figma. You could be doing graphic design, information architecture. But of course, if you're a freelancer, you always have to do that stuff, right? And I mean, you got your own business now, so you gotta wear all the hats. If you're renting a space, you even got to clean the bathroom, right? It's
Yeah.
like that's how it works. So it takes a lot to be an entrepreneur, obviously, right? I've actually had my own business in the past. I've owned I've owned a publishing company. I've put out CDs. I used to own a couple of game stores, one in San Francisco and one in Berkeley. And my whole family are entrepreneurs. I have an older brother who he owns his own lumber business, and I've got a sister in South Pasadena, and she and her husband have a property management company. So it's I think entrepreneurship runs in our blood, but I've always kind of just dabbled in it, and then went back to the corporate structure.
Wow. So I mean, that's fascinating. I never knew that. That's really cool. Fun fact: you mentioned that you had like a sort of publishing business. Had publishing CDs and stuff. I got my start in design when I was a sophomore in high school, designing album art for local
Nice.
bands that my dad was. My dad is a music and audio engineer, and so they would rent studio time from him, and he would figure out that they didn't have anybody to do their CD manufacturing. So he started a small business out of the house, and we
Nice.
would actually, I had to, like, he bought this giant Epson printer that sat in my room, that could actually print on the top of CDs. And
Wow.
I would design the album covers and print out the inserts and print on the CDs, and he would do all the mixing and the mastering, and we had like all these CD burners in his studio, and
Yeah.
we could burn about 4 CDs at a time, and we thought we were doing big things, man.
Yeah, I remember printing everything separately, right? So the CDs would get printed in one place, and then the booklets in another place, and then you get the jewel cases, and then everything gets sent to you, and you're just assembling it all, right? So that was a lot of work.
Yep, that was a family affair. When it was time to actually assemble everything, we would have sort of an assembly line, either in Dad's
Yep.
studio, and which was the family room, or the living room, and you'd have somebody stuffing, yeah, you have somebody cutting, somebody stuffing, and then putting the shrink wrap, putting the plastic on
Yep.
the outside of them, and taking the special blow dryer and blowing
Yep.
on it so that it shrunk down on the jewel case. So we had the
That
whole
was fun.
thing going, man. That's how I got my start.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, I think that uh, I've considered this a few times, like, the things that a UX designer has to be good at, the things a UX designer has to consider, and just for the purposes of this conversation, I know that people, like UX designers, in my opinion, like the modern term for it, sometimes it gets called product designer, right? So.
Right.
Um, I think those two roles are really interchangeable. A great UX designer is thinking about the business constraints, just like a product designer is. They're thinking about how it can be a great product, not just a great interface, and how it's actually solving the problem. And those things cause you to start to think more about how to make something somebody actually wants to use. And I think that's a core part of being an entrepreneur, of making something or selling something that solves a problem for somebody. I think those things that a UX designer has to think about and has to be good at thinking about makes them a prime candidate to be a good entrepreneur.
I completely agree, and I wrote that in my notes.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, listening and problem solving were the two things I wrote down, right? And I think that's kind of what drove me to UX, because I like puzzles and I like solving problems, because there's always more than one way to do it. So you get to experiment, see what works, see what doesn't, and then learn from your mistakes, right? Yeah, and I think entrepreneurs are doing the same thing. And they can either, start a consultancy and start solving it one-on-one with other people, or they can create a book or, a website that says, hey, this is free. Go figure it out, right? I already figured it out. They'll make my mistakes. And then you can sell other products to them, right? Courses or books, pamphlets, whatever. Consulting, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's what I do. I do consulting. I will eventually, God willing, come out with books and courses. I already have ideas on those things. But yeah, you wind up falling in love with a problem, and in the startup world, it's one of the things that they say: fall in love with the problem,
Yes.
and you'll want to solve it, and it will inherently make you very good at solving that problem, because you're always trying to solve it better. It protects you. Even protects you from disruption, because you're always looking at a way to solve the problem better, which is, disruption occurs when somebody's not solving the problem as well as somebody else, and customers start moving.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it reminds me of Apple, right? So Apple was never the first to do anything. They were a follower, but they said, we're going to make it better. And they did.
Right.
I remember when I first started working at Wells Fargo, someone was really into Apple. He was a graphic designer there. And I think Apple's stock at the time was like $8 a share. They were in the tank, right?
Ooh.
It was just after, before Steve Jobs came back. And then I worked at Washington Mutual for a little while, and I got into Apple pretty heavy. In fact, one of the first books I published back in '94, I was on like a LC2, Apple LC2 that they don't have anymore, obviously. But that was like top of the line, and I used Aldus PageMaker to put it together, and then Adobe ended up buying Aldus. So yeah, it's just, you can see the trend happening, and Apple knows what the future looks like, and then they start building it now. So
yeah. I remember, like they'll enter a market sometimes and do something that either somebody else already tried to do, or sometimes they do something and they do it in a way that nobody else has done it yet. I think one of the great examples is the iPhone, right? Like nobody had taken the step of coming up with a smartphone. Like they didn't invent the smartphone, right? They invent the smartphone, but nobody else had done it quite that way, to where, they were like, we're not going to have any buttons on the front of it except for the home button. That's the only button it had. You're going to have a software keyboard. Nobody had decided we're going to do 100% software keyboard. And I remember a lot of people saying, oh man, no, I could never just type on a screen. I got to have a physical keyboard, man. I don't know what they're thinking and all that stuff. And of course the iPhone just went on to like dominate in the US. And then the iPad, I think, is another example. That one, I do think that one was a little more unique in that nobody had made something in that form factor, at least that I can remember, because it was easy to know that, like, other people had made smartphones, right? Like you had other people out there making smartphones and PDAs and stuff like that. You had the BlackBerry, which was that was the, if you had a BlackBerry, you were important, right? Like
Yeah,
If you wanted to let people know you were important, you pulled the BlackBerry out of the pocket and put it on the table at lunch, right? Um,
exactly.
that was the thing. But when the iPad came out, I remember that was definitely different from a lot of the other form factors that have been presented, and I remember thinking to myself, that is that like that's going to save certain types of media, right? Like I already saw that like magazine purchases and things like that, print newspaper purchases were going down, were decreasing, and I thought to
Yeah,
myself, and things like comic books. That was actually one of the things I thought. I saw the iPad, and at the time I was
yeah,
really into doing comic book art, and I said that thing's going to save comics. And
yeah,
the comic publishers thought the same thing because they started putting comic books out for the iPad form factor, and it worked really well. And it didn't take them long at
yeah.
all.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big comic book fan. Mostly Marvel, but what made comic books so famous was the stories, right, and the art. And now you got the big screen to tell those stories. And technology is so incredible now that you can watch the Avengers and pay your $20 and
Yeah,
watch it on a big screen.
that's right. That's right. I'm kind of curious to know, in your mind, what what about a UX designer might be a typical or kind of inherent trait that makes somebody a good UX designer that might hold them back from being a good entrepreneur.
Yeah, that's a good one. I I think what I've seen, and I've been this UX designer, right? Is that when you're younger, you're learning it, you get kind of cocky, and you grow this ego of like, well, I can do something that you can't, or I have a specialty, and then you get into this fixed mindset that you get trapped in, and that will hold you back because you don't listen as well, and you tell your clients or your stakeholders that they're wrong, and it doesn't create a good relationship, right? And so it, that would be a bad trait for entrepreneurs, right? Trying to sell something that nobody wants. Look what I built. It's great, but nobody buys it, right? That's not going to work. So you got to check your ego at the door, and you have to say yes, um, and you just have to be willing to be wrong, right? And admit that you can be wrong, and then that will get you to the point where I need to learn this, and I'm going to learn it, right? So as an example, when I got into UX through coding, right? So when I was publishing in '94, soon after the Mosaic browser came out, right? And I was already on the internet using, code like Unix, like checking email in Unix. So there was no graphics. So when HTML1 came out, I'm like, I gotta learn this. So I got a book for $20, and it was just basically trial and error, right? And back then the web was simple. It was just like a Microsoft Word doc, in HTML. But soon after, you add graphics and you learn CSS. But I really wanted to be able to send a web form and get a response, right? So I had to learn like CGI scripting, and so it kind of just built up over time. And like I even had, a couple years ago, I was coding in Swift UI, just for fun, just to learn it, and I learned a lot. And then I learned like if I really want to get deep into this, I have to just become an iOS developer, and I don't think I wanted to do that because the technology is changing fast. And I mean, look at Chat GPT, right? Everybody's talking about Chat GPT. And I don't know. My initial response was, I don't need that. But then I figured, well, I have a curiosity, so let's figure out what this thing is, and it's pretty cool. And you can use it in your day to day, right? Of course, you have to tweak it. It's not going to give you perfection, but it's not a human, but it still makes mistakes. uh, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think technology is, you really have to stay on top of technology. You can't have that closed mindset of I don't want to look at it.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's funny you mentioned Chat GPT, because my first response to it was like, oh wow, that's cool. I I had a decent amount of skepticism that it would be able to write in a way that was going to replace good human writing,
Yeah.
which is largely played out to be true. Like you can look at, and um, it can write things that are out there. It's obviously gathering its data from what's out there, and it can write things that sound typical, and it can even have different tones of voice, etc. But I've found that the way that it writes, it's going to be hard to get something that sounds differentiated from it. And so, it's a great starting point, though. I mean, and that's one of the things that I think is fantastic about it. It's amazing that you can use it to come up with ideas. You can use it to kind of give you a starting point to be able to write something. And that's but like, it is going to revolutionize things, and that there's a lot of kind of run of the mill stuff out there. And if you're producing run of the mill stuff, ChatGPT is going to replace you. I mean,
Exactly.
it's not going to be a whole lot of room for that anymore. Nobody's going to be willing to pay a human to do that anymore. Yeah. And that, I think that ChatGPT is going to make that a reality pretty quickly. I mean, obviously it's not great at, you said it makes mistakes, which it does. It's not great at like understanding nuanced facts or being able to accurately mention things that have happened in history. It's best at generative things, but I mean, if you're just trying to create a blog post, some run of the mill blog post, and maybe go in and edit it a little bit afterwards. I mean, humans that are making run of the mill blog posts are going to get replaced real soon.
Yeah. And it's for, an outline for your podcast, right? It gives you a great outline. Just give it a topic, say it's a 30-minute podcast or something, and it'll spit out some ideas for you.
That's right. Yeah. I haven't even tried that yet, but I've been tempted to do that, just because, you need a lot of content to have an ongoing podcast. And I've seen other people use it to come up with ideas. And I can appreciate that, right? Because any of us is being creative. We're just taking things that we've seen and combining them in a new way. And it's not to say that nobody ever produces anything new, right? But like generally, what we're doing when we're being creative is taking what we've absorbed and putting it together in a way that it hasn't been put together before. And I think that, I mean, Chat GPT is basically doing that. It's sourcing a lot more content than can be sourced by a human in a short amount of time, and spitting out ideas there. So I think it's going to be hugely beneficial for that. I think it's a great use for it.
Yeah, I saw something about Midjourney. I think it was on LinkedIn or Twitter, and people were complaining that AI generated art is stealing, right? And I'm like, well, it's not really, because look at what Andy Warhol did. He just basically took, Campbell's soup cans and put a spin on it. But even though it's derivative, it's different, right? And even nature, like if I go to the store and I pick out two lemons, they look exactly the same, but they're unique, right? If I name them, I probably wouldn't be able to tell them apart. But it's, I don't know. It's an interesting concept having, like if I were to take, a pencil and a paper and look at someone's art and then draw it myself, that's not stealing. that's like my representation of what I see, because it's gonna look different. Even if I trace it, it's gonna be different. So it's interesting. I don't know where this is gonna go, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think that like I understand some of the arguments. Like some arguments aren't good or well thought out, but some are. And I think probably the strongest argument for when somebody say like, "Hey, this is stealing," is when the AI art generator is literally ingesting images and sort of bashing them, and you can see the artifacts of the artist's signature. Or you can see the artifact of the Getty Images watermark in there still.
I've seen those.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, you definitely copied. You're you're taking copyrighted images, and that is illegal.
That's stealing. Yes.
Yeah, and so, but like when you have, I've seen some stuff that AI art generators are doing that it is extremely difficult for me to understand how it could do that unless it was actually, creating something.
Right.
I've seen it make some things that I'm like, I've never seen anything that looks like that. Maybe they took an image and they it adjusted it some. But what it's doing there, some of those, I'm like, that's pretty dang original. I mean, I don't know that that a human artist could say they were doing much difference. If it's putting down brushstrokes, man, like no qualms for me. If you're ingesting images that like you basically sucked out of Google Images or whatever, aggregator you're getting, and there's watermarks and artist signatures in there, yeah, like I think they deserve to go after you. And you've got it coming. But some of that other stuff, the USPTO office basically just said, hey, if it's completely 100% generated by AI, then it can't be copyrighted because it wasn't made by a human. I tend to agree with that, especially because the way that art is created is still too much, in my opinion, linked to ingesting images and just kind of bashing them together. But I think that it's going to enter a new territory. I was talking to a lawyer friend of mine that they're going to have to update the law at some point because it's going to get advanced enough where it's putting down brushstrokes, if you will. And once the machine is putting down brushstrokes, is it the prompter that gets the copyright? I think so. As long as it wasn't ingesting copyrighted images to do that, I think so. I think the prompter gets the copyright.
Exactly. I fully support copyright. Having put out other people's, music, you have to ask for permission and make sure they get their royalties and stuff. But the interesting thing about the copyright disclaimer on a book, if you read it, it says cannot be stored in a retrieval system, which is actually your brain, right? So technically reading a book is illegal, especially if you do a review on that book and you said, this is what I read. It's like, well, that's technically legal based on the copyright law. So, and that's been around since 1972 or something, or even before that. So yeah, the lawmakers have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Catching up to do.
I will say that right at this moment, I do not envy copyright. Anybody who's going to have to engage in updating the copyright laws. I do not envy those people. I do envy the consultants that will be hired to help them make the laws because they will make a lot of money.
Exactly. And I actually thought about going back to school and becoming like an IP lawyer and learning about copyright and patents and stuff and trademarks, but no. Too boring.
Yeah, I that same lawyer friend, he shows me sometimes some of the stuff that he has to write for cases, and I don't think I could do it, man. I'd probably just as well jump off a bridge before I had to write that much of something that's that boring to me. He loves it, man.
Chat GPT.
That's right. We're gonna get to the point where they're not even writing it. Chat GPT's writing it for them.
Yeah. Making $250 an hour.
That's right.
Or more.
Oh man, once I started learning a lot of the ins and outs of being a lawyer, I was like, I understand why you guys make that much money. I mean, if you're going to go through that much pain, you deserve it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I kind
kind
of
of
feel the same with realtors too, because they have to do all the paperwork and file it, and that's too boring for me.
and manage the expectations of buyers, the unrealistic
Yeah,
expectations of buyers, and all that stuff. Yeah. Oh yeah. I definitely feel for the realtors for sure. Oh
right.
man. Kind of going back to like, what would make what traits of a UX designer might hinder them from being a great entrepreneur. You kind of touched on your thoughts on that. I think from my
Mhm.
perspective, the things that I can talk about, the things that have hindered me.
Okay.
I can tend to, and I'm not saying every UX designer has this problem, but I know that I can tend to want to put something out that I feel like is the best possible experience, and I don't want to put it out until I feel like it's the best possible experience, and that's kind of antithetical to speed to
Yeah.
market and being able
Yeah.
to run a business
Perfectionism, right?
and yeah, perfectionism. It's really, and I know that a lot of UX designers can kind of struggle with that. But I think that it's definitely something that you can overcome. When I went into business for myself, I had to overcome that. I had
Yeah.
to get to the point where I realized I'm not going to make money if I don't go ahead and put this out right now. It's no longer about whether I think it is the best possible thing that I can do right now. Where I absolutely just pour everything into it, and I couldn't possibly have done anything better in that moment. It is the best thing that I could do with the constraints that I have when I have a family
Yeah.
to feed.
That's the important part.
Yes, and
Yeah.
that will make things real for you very quickly. So I don't know how every designer would respond to that, but I know that perfectionism is a thing that a lot of designers it's part of what can make them good. They have a very high bar of quality, and they want to meet that bar, and they kind of define themselves and their skill by that bar. And they're not completely wrong on that, but in some ways they are wrong to say that because what you shipped wasn't the pinnacle, that you're not a great designer. No, it means y'all didn't have time to ship the pinnacle, man. Like that's what it means.
Yeah. There was a recent study done on grade schoolers on output, right? And there were two groups of children, and one group was told to make the best thing they could. I think it was pottery or something. And then they told the other children to just make as many as you can, right? And can you guess like who did better?
Oh yeah, I mean definitely the ones who had more at bats, man, the ones who made more
Yeah,
pottery and just let it fly.
exactly. Yeah, because they learned, they did it quickly, and they learned from what didn't work, and then they went and they created something amazing. And I've heard, I started writing on Medium like I don't know, 6 or 7 months ago. And the one thing everyone says is just, even if you think it's garbage, just put it out, right? Because you have to take a chance sometimes. Um, and it's good advice, because again, the market's going to decide. If somebody sees it and they like it, they'll tell their friends, and it'll grow. If nobody sees it, then, well, 10 years later, they might see it and love it.
That's right.
It's a matter of timing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember, I also do art, and I remember in high school, good friend of mine, he and I've been friends for like 25 years now, and we were in class one day, and I'm drawing something, and I'm mad because I know that it's not matching the vision of quality that I have in my head. So I'm getting ready to rip it out and crumple it up and throw it away. And he stops me and he says, "Don't ever do that again." And I realized he was saying, "You think this is trash." He said, "You think this is trash, but to everybody else, this is good. So
Yeah.
don't you need to let other people have a chance to decide whether or not it's good to them, and not always think that what you're judging it to be is the truth." And that
Yeah.
had an impact on me.
we're our worst critics, right? Yeah, especially with art. Um, but yeah, I'm glad he made you not crumple that up.
Yeah. Yeah, it was definitely a milestone moment. He probably doesn't even know that that moment had as much of an effect on me as it did. But I think that that's one thing that designers, if they have that struggle, they've got to be able to overcome that in order to be a good entrepreneur. I think the other thing is sometimes designers can have this sort of negative view of business and
Yeah.
what's necessary to run a business that works for your customers and works for you, that rewards you well. And I think that's another thing that has to be overcome for a lot of designers, that like business things aren't yucky. If you're providing real value, people want to compensate you for that. They want to give you value for you providing them value. And I think designers are they're well positioned to be able to do that, as long as the things that you were mentioning, being able to ask questions and to listen. A good UX designer is good at listening, especially ones that do user interviews regularly or at least sit in on them. They're good at listening to the market, and or they could be good at it, probably better than they think.
Yeah.
And as long as you're doing that and you're giving people something that really solves their problem, they want to give you money. But I know, you start talking about business stuff with some designers, and they're saying, "Low, I'm above that. Like I don't have to deal with that." Have you experienced any of that?
Not really. But I could see it happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced some of that. I think that it's becoming less popular. I think the startup world, as a matter of fact, the startup world made it less popular because a designer working at a startup is closer to the metal, the
Hmm.
success of the business. Usually, they're sacrificing something to go work at a startup, especially if they're strapped for cash. You're sacrificing some compensation, so you want the business to do well because you want the payoff.
Right.
And so I feel like the startup world has brought designers a little bit closer to how the sausage is made, and it's made business stuff less yucky to designers as a whole. Because I could say about 10 years ago, it was definitely a little more common to have designers kind of stick their nose up at some of the business concerns. But now I don't find it as much, and that is it's definitely a welcome change.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of where like partnership and diversity comes in, right? So let's say you got someone who's really into business, but they don't know anything about like creativity, right? They need someone who has the creativity who doesn't care about business, and then they can share the results.
Right, right, and to not demonize one another for
Right.
their unique perspectives that are both needed in order to make the ship run, right? In order to make the ship
Yeah,
float. And
I
that's
agree.
I struggled for a while with being mad at, like, when somebody who was being held responsible for business results would pull a project or pull the rug from under us, or want something to happen at a certain pace. And
Yeah.
I think that it took UX design as a practice a while to really mature enough to be fast. I think that was something also that the startup world helped along, because you had to be able to produce good things faster. So you had lean UX and things like this that came out. And I think that was one of the things that I didn't understand until a certain point. That there you have to be able to put things out that may be less than perfect, that are good enough, and it's not a reflection on your craft necessarily, and that's really
Yeah.
the distinction that has to be made. It's not a reflection on your craft. It's what you can put out now, and that gives you the chance to be able to put something out later. It gives you another at bat. You can be like the kids in the class who made a bunch of pottery, right, and
Right.
ultimately got better. There's a similar study done with people learning photography. They had some people basically, focus on just making a few really good photos, and then you had, the other group that they were told just take as many photos as you can, and of course that second group, they produced the better photography in the end because they were learning more.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, so I think ultimately, you've been in business multiple times for yourself. You've worked at large companies. What is your advice to UX designers who are thinking about starting their own business?
Just start. You can't, there's not going to be a perfect day, right? If it's something you want to do, go do it. And the more you work on it, the more you realize, yeah, this is what I want to do, or no, I don't want to do it. Right. And there's always not going to be a special time. Right. So it's always take action. Don't wait.
That's very good. That's very good. How do you know when something's good enough to release?
Oh, wow. That depends. As an example, I think things do get released where UX designers oh, this is not the time, right? But they're usually at a large corporation. They're not the one in charge. They're not the stakeholder that makes that decision, right? So when you have a timeline and you've got a budget, if you're starting to go over budget, you need to get that thing out, right? It's when movies go over budget, they say you got to put this out. It's well, we need to edit it. No, just put it out. So I don't know. I think at one point, I think it was Gladiator, the movie Gladiator. They did some preview screenings, of the Ridley Scott movie, and it got panned before it actually got released officially. But they took the research and they made some new edits. They did some refilming, I believe, and then they put it out, and it became a hit, right? So, and that's the important part of testing what you put out. If you have the budget to test, you really should. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, I think that that is one thing that especially a seasoned UX designer is going to have experience with, and it's going to be used to seeing people use their stuff and not in any way use it the way that you thought that they would use it, and have to iterate. Right. And I mean, those are things that any entrepreneur has to go through. Know, whether you're doing services or creating a product.
I think the other important thing when you're working at a large company is the importance of just a heuristic review, right? So let's say you work on something and you're only working with the project team and they're forcing you to get it put out, right? And maybe you do a usability test, maybe you don't. But other experts within the org should look at it, right? Because they're going to see things that you might have missed, or they're going to see things that you told the project team, but they didn't listen to, right? So you've got two voices now, or maybe three, saying the same thing. That project team might start listening. And I think that's important. And for entrepreneurship, you have to give your stuff to your peers for review, right? Hey, Devin, give me a testimonial on this book, the ebook I wrote, right? And you could read it and go, oh, this is horrible. You don't want to put this out. I can't put my name on this. I can't back this, right? So that's also important. So as an entrepreneur or a UX professional, you should always ask for feedback on your work, right? Because if you doubt yourself and you're the only, like with your crumpled piece of paper, right? You were judging your own work. You need to put it out there and let other people judge it for you.
Right. So any UX designers in the audience, if you think that it's good enough, you probably waited too long. You probably waited too long. If you haven't already put it out there and tested it yet, if you have and you think it's good enough, it's probably because you got feedback and you refined it. But that is cool. So the last question I'll ask is is there anything sort of in the business space that you're reading right now that you think other people should be reading?
Oh man, there's a lot. There's like, I actually just got an account with short form. It's like they summarize books, right? So, you know, Atomic Habits is on there, and Ultra Learning is a good one. But I've been, yeah, I don't have my library in front of me right now, but well, maybe I do. Hang on, let me open my books.
All right, man, we're getting access here.
Let's see here. Something I just got, but I haven't read yet. Superminds. There's something called The Nuclear Effect. Let me see if I can find something I read so I can get oh man, there's just too much. One thing I'll talk about really quickly is this concept. Have you heard of Zettelkasten?
No.
So Zettelkasten basically means like slip notes, like a German word. And it was Nicholas Luhmann was this a sociologist essentially and a professor, and he wrote like some insane amount of books, like 70 books in his lifetime. And he did everything on note cards. So when he read a book, he would take notes and he would create it on a note card, and then he would file it in his own system. And he's got thousands of cards. So there's digital software now, like Obsidian, Notion, that people are using, and they're calling it a digital Zettelkasten. But the thing that I don't like about it is that it doesn't have that spatial memory. It doesn't give you the spatial memory, right? So like if I take this book, Articulating Design Decisions, I leave it in my kitchen, I'll have a mental note of where it is. But whenever I take notes, if it's all in one place, it's just on your computer or the cloud. You can't really find it without searching. And if you didn't tag it correctly, you're not going to be able to find it. So I really like spatial memory, and I like using pen and paper to write because it makes more of an impression on your mind, right? It's called like neural imprinting, and you'll remember it better. So if you take notes, if you rewrite it, you're more likely to remember it. And then when you look at it again, it'll bring that memory back.
Wow.
So I'm learning a little bit about Zettelkasten.
That so how do you spell that?
I think it's Zettlkasten.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. I'll definitely look into that. I've been going through this. Actually, it's funny you mentioned this. I've been going through this with my wife really, because she's getting into bullet journaling. There we go. All right, he's got it on screen. Now I've committed it to visual memory. That's usually how I have to see something in order to remember how to spell it. But you know, she's gotten into bullet journaling, and I looked at the bullet journaling system, and I looked at it and I was like, it's too much. It's too much. But I found myself wanting more and more to go back to capturing ideas in my Moleskine notebook. And you know, just randomly being able to sketch things in there, and you know, I like that it's a blank page and I can do whatever I want with it. And you know, I've noticed that, you know, I can take notes on my iPad, and I do that a decent amount. But like with either the iPad or the Moleskine, and I run into the problem of I don't really go back and look at it too much. And so there's funny things have occurred where I've put notes in my Moleskine, and I'll have some idea and I'll write it down, and then I'll just flip through my Moleskine sometimes, and I'll come across the same idea like a year earlier. And I was like, I thought I was writing down something new, and I had already written this exact same thing like a year earlier. And so, you know, having a system to be able to index that stuff, I still think that I very much enjoy the act of writing something on paper in a notebook that does have a spatial element to it. I remember about where in the notebook I wrote it, right? Like how many pages were before it and how many pages were after. Like I know it's generally like in the middle or to the first quarter of the notebook or something like that. And I've realized that does have a different effect on my memory. And I treat that differently than I treat digital notes. When I can create a completely digital note, unless I'm very intentional about organizing it, which I tend to be depending on what it is. But other things I'm not. And when I'm not intentional about it, it goes into the ether, man. Once I close that note, it may never get opened again.
Yeah. I've done that with both, digital notes and like analog notes, where maybe it's a year old. I'll look at it, I'll be like, oh, this is really good. Who wrote this? I'm like, oh, I wrote this.
Oh man.
Sometimes it's not so good, but
yeah, I will say I do also have those moments where I go back and look at things that I wrote and I was like, man, that was trash. I'm glad I never did anything with that.
Yeah.
Man, that's awesome. Joe, thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn, Joe Rapoza, or on Twitter. I think it's Rapoza_J, I believe.
Cool.
Twitter. Yeah.
Awesome.
Or Medium too. I'm on Medium.
Oh, all right. You got to give me the Medium link. Folks, will make sure to put that in the show notes. I've definitely been enjoying Joe's writing. He's got a lot of personality to it. It's fun to read. Highly recommend you check him out. He's got some insightful thoughts and generally it seems like you're generating buzz, you're generating discussion, which I love. It's cool.
Thanks a lot, Devin, and happy birthday, man.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it, man. We'll have to have you back on. As always, great talking to Joe. I think the gist of this is, if you're a UX designer, you came hardwired with the skills to be able to solve problems for people. You should take that skill and find a problem to solve and figure out how to build a business model around it. As Uri Levine, the founder of Waze, says, fall in love with the problem, not the solution. If you're a business leader and you have UX designers that you think it's time for them to step up and take more ownership of the business, try to mentor one of those. Also, if you're in the Atlanta area, on April 19th, I'm going to be speaking at CX Forums in Atlanta. And I'm really excited about this. I'm going to be speaking alongside some really talented customer experience professionals. And hey, they gave me a discount code to give to people. If you go to buy tickets, put in Devin20, DEVIN 20 in the coupon code field, and you'll get 20% off of your tickets. I can't wait for the event. I think it's going to be a good time. It'll be awesome to see you there. Again, folks, if you enjoyed the show today, don't forget to give me a like and consider subscribing. And until next time, keep outserving your competition on your relentless pursuit to become an experience leader. Catch you in the next one.